So my name is Tekla. I'm from Georgia, and my presentation will be about plants and trees becoming Buddha, which in Japanese is Soumoko Jobutsu. So I will talk this in the context of Japanese Buddhism. And before going to my presentation, I want to mention that I am not a Buddhist scholar. I'm doing Japanese modern philosophy, so I'm dealing mostly with the interpretations of Buddhism. So this is how I'm gonna pursue my presentation. It won't be the plants and trees becoming Buddha problem inside Buddhism, but rather than problem of its interpretations. The beginning of 20th century, when Japan was in search of its identity, nature became some kind of grip to contrast itself from the Occident as the other, as the Orient itself. There are many essays and books written in this time period about this special relationship with nature of Japan, without the further reflections of what did they mean with this word nature, how it was translated, and other problems. We can quote multiple of these kind of ideas, but I thought that maybe most representative will be a very, very influential book from Suzuki Daisetsu, the Buddhist scholar in Japan. And this certain quote is from his book, Zen and Japanese Culture, and chapter Love of Nature. As he says, in the East, however, the idea of subjecting nature to the commands of service of man according to his selfish desires has never been cherished, for nature to us has never been uncharitable. It is not a kind of enemy to be brought under man's power. We of the Orient have never conceived nature in the form of opposing power. On the contrary, nature has been our constant friend and companion. So we can see here how this myth is creating a Japanese view of nature. And this idea is still alive nowadays, even though many revisions are done in order to question this almost ideological tendency. But still, many revisiting the original texts are needed to uncover what misinterpretations happened during a modern era, which is a Meiji period in Japan, and ask if this discussion of Japanese view of nature has meaning at all. Or we are just forcing non-existing concepts on other cultures. Here I would like to introduce the Buddhist debate taking place in Heian period in Japan, in the context of Tendai school, the school of Buddhism. So one of the critique of this idea that Japan has a special way to see nature is contemporary Buddhist scholar Sue Fumiko. And in his book, Idea of Buddhahood of Plants and Trees, in Japanese, Somoku Jobutsu no Shiso, the famous misconception of this particular Buddhist debates are represented by the words of the former Prime Minister of Japan, Nakasone Yasuhiro. As he said in his speech, around 2,500 years ago, Shakyamuni said, whatever is above heaven or under heaven, I only reign supreme. And in Buddhist thought, they say that mountains, rivers, plants, and trees, everything become Buddha. This is essence of Oriental philosophy. We Japanese think that great nature is a human's home and live in harmony with animals and plants. The philosophy of symbiosis is nourished in the long history of Japanese nation. So the scale of misrepresentations here is quite obvious, and one could argue that this kind of rhetoric in politics is very common, this kind of simplifications and stereotypical notions. But this is a problem of politics. What matters for philosophy is to understand how the certain ideologies are established and enforced. There are three let's say these things that we can problematize here generally. One would be to associate this problem of Somoku Jobutsu, plants and trees becoming Buddha, as the idea of Buddhism as a whole. And the second problem, to generalize this problem to whole Japanese thought. And this also includes to make Japanese thought representative as a whole Orient world. And the third problem, what matters for us in this presentation, will be the associating it with the problem of human and nature. So before going to the specific text, let us see the discourse that those debates were taking place. And in the end, we can think in what extent can the comparison with the Western or this order of thinking is possible, or if we can connect this to the concept of nature at all. so what is the original idea and development behind this idea of enlightenment of plants and trees, which is in Japanese somoku jobutsu, and somoku is plants and trees, jobutsu becoming Buddha. So I will be mentioning sometimes in Japanese. So, well, first time mentioned in China, 7th century, it became a target for several famous debates in China as well as in Japan. The idea of enlightenment in plants and trees has been developed based on the sutra called Awakening of Faith in Mahayana, in Japanese Daijo Kishinro. A text that popularized certain understanding of Tathagata, in Japanese Shinyo or Nyorai, as a synonymous of Buddha essence. Sometimes they say Buddha nature, Busho in Japanese. And this sutra influenced a further claim that there is a Buddhahood, this Busho, in everything that transmigrate. Things that transmigrate in Japanese, it's called shujo. So here's this phrase also written in Japanese, inside shujo, shitsuyu busho. So resulting then seeing Tathagata, which is the, let's say, this word means as it is, world as it is, not only as a position of enlightened one, which is Buddha, but also for ordinary people, bonbu in Japanese. So this made the distance between beings that are not enlightened, ordinary beings, and Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, they draw them closer. The distance between were reduced. And we can also consider Somoku Jobutsu, so enlightenment in plants and trees, as the continuation of this process, making enlightenment more and more total and all-inclusive. And also they start the debate about enlightening of things that do not transmigrate. So they're not in this process of rebirth. And those are plants and trees. So then we should see now the what do we mean by transmigration? How come the plants and trees are not included there? So we must see this classification that is based on a cosmology of Indian Buddhism. But we should also consider that this concept of transmigration was totally absent in China and in Japan. So it was an import. This is not a rebirth in other species, but into other worlds. As you might know, there are 6 worlds of humans, animals, and we have ghosts and gods, etc. And it is important to know that this is not a classification in order to objectively define the perceivable world. It is absolutely incompatible with modern classification that we are used to. Well, most familiar classification for us will be humans, animals, and plants, which can be traced back to Aristotle, as you know. And then came the modern idea of life. And we started to divide these things into non-living beings and living beings, and everything that has life, this universal thing that moves things, right? Then it started to be dealt with biology, which is a very new study, right? So this is non-existent division in Indian and Chinese system of thought, this living beings, non-living beings, right? So everything that goes into rebirth, which means that everything that suffers, acts, and accumulates karma is regarded as shujo, sattva in Sanskrit, and in English it's translated as sentient beings. So this shouldn't be taken as a synonymous for living beings. It doesn't have to do anything. These two contexts are totally different. So the counter word for shujo, the things that transmigrate, will be Buddha, because Buddha stopped transmigration, goes to nirvana. But also in China, when the translations were made, there was one more translation of sentient being, which was ujo, and its opposite word has been created, which is mujo or hijo, which means non-sentient beings, referring things that from the beginning do not transmigrate. And this word made it possible to talk about plants and trees in China, in Chinese Buddhism. So I will go directly to texts that I will quote. First will be from the Tendai monk in Japan called Anen. The text will be from 9th century, called, well, in English it will be Recordings of Buddhahood in Plants and Trees. Let's go to the second question that is asked here. Do the plants and trees become Buddha depending on their own mind or mind of others. And the question is, the answer is, question of whatever it is depending on its own mind or minds of others is the question of other teachings. According to Enkyo, which is a Tendai teaching, enlightenment of plants and trees are mind itself without any active and passive. Well, therefore, plants and trees become Buddha. So Sommoku Jobutsu, the enlightenment of plants and trees, can be thought in two ways. One is that the first case is that because the enlightenment of Buddha, by enlightenment of Buddha, whole world becomes enlightened, and then the practice of sentient beings should result also enlightenment of non-sentient beings, right? But this is the point that Anen criticizes here, saying that plants and trees themselves independently acquire awakening. No matter it is considered ujo or mujo, non-sentient or sentient, reaching enlightenment itself only should happen from within. So there's only one kind of enlightenment, right, from within. And if enlightenment is everywhere universal and all-inclusive, then non-sentients will have the same kind of enlightenment as sentient beings. So the other text that I will introduce is from the tradition of, this is also in Tendai school Buddhism in Japan, from the tradition of Hongaku. In English it will be original enlightenment. And here we have the dialogue between, this comes later than the first text. So Ryogen answers to the question of his disciple Kaku in the next quote. It is argued that as bodhisattvas attain Buddhahood, plants and trees are already endowed with the four aspects of birth, preservation, changing, and extinction. Therefore, we know that when plants and trees do resolution and practice, it is the same as practice of sentient beings. It is important to mention that a Hongaku tradition, the original enlightenment, is a thought that world as it is already enlightened. So the affirmation of the world as enlightened enforces the idea of arinomama in Japanese. Translation would be as it is. And the main idea of this dialogue is that plants and trees are inside the rebirth cycle, the birth and extinction cycle, as represented with these four words: birth, preservation, changing, and extinction. And therefore, they go through the Buddha way of practice and enlightenment. So this transmigration cycle should not be understood as life cycle, as sometimes it happens. So in the end, what was the effect and result of these debates that we have in this concrete time period, this historical time in China and Japan? So in Japan, after Heian period, the popularity of original enlightenment idea diminishes, and then in Edo period is this almost gone and is as it is considered. And the problem was that first of all, we should not take these ideas as any representation of Japanese Buddhism, or we should not do any generalizations, because first of all, its popularity was in a certain time period of Japanese Buddhism, and also it was a very criticized idea because it had a tendency to reject practice. If everything already is enlightened, then we don't need a practice anymore, right, in order to get enlightened. So we should not consider this, or even inside the Tendai Japanese Buddhism, as a mainstream idea. So it is only the modern times that the original enlightenment Hongaku tradition comes back, and there's many factors of this. One of the things is the popularization of Western philosophy, when the idea of absolute becomes popular in Japan, and they see it in the idea of tatakata, which is shinyo, and then this sutra of this Daijoki Shinron, awakening of faith in Mahayana, becomes very popular. And one of the association that was made inside this sutra is the phrase, the one mind. Well, there's no other word to translate. Ishin becomes associated with Hegel's objective spirit, and then the arinomama, the word as it is, becomes somehow associated to this naturalness, spontaneity, the idea that comes from Romanticism itself and American transcendentalism. And also there was another association that was made with Somoku Jobutsu and plants and trees becoming Buddha, with the idea of universal life. And we can see some examples here. So this emerging idea of love of nature as a national character begins in the 20th century, when a professor of Tokyo University, Fujioka Sakutaro, writes in his book that proactive love of nature, in Japanese, 自然に対する積極的な愛, is an exceptional quality of Japanese people. And at the same time, 10 points of national character gets published, and one of them is a love of plants and trees, Somoku no Ai. Here the term Somoku becomes also part of ideology of Japanese view of nature. And this time, Somoku is in an unusual pairing with word love, Ai, which is also a modern concept. So it's imported to Japan. And then I provided one more quote from Minamoto, who is a Japanese culture scholar. And he says, Kokai's teaching of our unity with Dainchi Nyorai, which is Buddha, is a symbol of cosmic life, taught ancient Japanese a practical method of identification with nature. And Tendai's original Enlightenment, Hongaku, teaching of Buddhahood in plants and trees, preached that natural objects themselves are religious existence. As we see, the tendency of considering Tathagata and Buddha himself as a principle of universalism takes over here, and it also merges with this modern concept of life and living beings. Buddha at these times becomes somehow a representation of this universal life, and therefore Somoku becomes some kind of natural object, as if its existence as a living being was preceded its religious meaning. So even though this classification of living beings is completely absent in Indian Chinese cosmology as we saw it, the popularity of ecology from 70s and 80s and its revival principle of life somehow puts the Buddhist world in its own context. And now we can see Somoku Jobutsu idea used for agendas of environmental ideas, like, for example, in the book, Nature in Asian Traditions of Thought, Lafro writes about these above-mentioned debates between Ryogen and Kaku. So next quotation. Ryogen's most significant contribution to the discussion lay in the creation of nexus between the biological life cycle of a plant and the process of enlightenment as experienced by a human being. He interprets the natural process as being, in fact, a religious one. So we can see the similarities here with Minamoto's text by considering Somoku as unquestionable representation of biological life, completely ignoring novelty of the idea of biological life itself and incompatibility of the context. There's also this thing that he takes sentient and non-sentient being idea, he transformed it to the problem of plants and human beings. So we made it clear that sentient beings, non-sentient beings can't be that easily understood as human and nature or any other thing that we are used to. So the problem is not only that these medieval texts were involved in creation of Japanese idealized view of nature, but also it runs deeper. Even if we limit the context of this text and say it is only about certain tradition of original enlightenment in Japanese Buddhism, most of the time it will still cause the discussions about nature or environment. And we saw how it started and how it developed. The question here now is that, can we talk about Somoku, plants and trees, outside of context of Somoku Jobutsu, plants and trees reaching Buddhahood? I mean here, this Somoku itself, of course, this is a word and it doesn't come from the Buddhist terminology, it is a common word itself. But what I mean here is that the Somoku in the debates that we saw, can we isolate that word from the whole context of plants and trees becoming Buddha? And my final argument will be that Somoku Jobutsu is the idea that is centered on the essence of enlightenment rather than what plants and trees essentially are. It is not a description of reality of plants and trees, neither does it try to establish knowledge of plants and trees. The discussion of plants and trees became necessary when the idea of enlightenment had reached this stage where it was all-inclusive and total. And discussion of plants and trees also emerged this discussion of the practice was not necessary anymore. It was the continuation of the tendency of reducing the distance between Buddhas and ordinary beings. So in arts, for example, in Japan, the depiction of mountains, rivers, and plants realizing their Buddhahood symbolically expressed the totality of Tathagata, Shinyo, or Nyorai. In this concrete idea of Buddhahood of plants and trees, they do not have an existence outside the world of enlightenment. In other words, these plants and trees are not the same plants and trees that we are using as commodities, aesthetic pleasure, and medication. So Somoku does not pre-exist the idea of enlightenment, idea of Somoku Jobutsu, and they are inseparable. If we say that they do pre-exist, we are forcing Western classical idea of representation on Buddhism. Therefore, neither nature or environment is compatible with the idea of Somoku Jobutsu, and using it as a part of Japanese or any other kind of view of nature is causing some further misconceptions. So thank you.